Time is supposed to heal. But for some, it only counts the years stolen. Across the world, innocent men and women have lived entire lifetimes in prison cells, not because of what they did, but because of what the system refused to see. They entered as young people with dreams and left as elders carrying decades of silence, injustice, and survival, and reminded the world of one haunting question. How many innocent people are still waiting to be believed? But among all those who suffered in silence, one man's story stands above the rest. Nearly half a century lost to a crime he didn't commit. Glynn Simmons, Oklahoma, USA. In 1975, a young man named Glynn Simmons stood in an Oklahoma courtroom accused of a murder he didn't commit. He was 22 years old, barely stepping into adulthood, when the gavel came down and sealed his fate. Life without parole. No physical evidence, no confession, no solid proof. Just the shaky memory of an eyewitness and a story that the prosecution was desperate to make fit. It was a different time. No DNA testing, no body cameras, no internet to rally behind a cause. Back then, when the system pointed its finger, people believed it. And Glynn, an innocent man, became just another number in the machinery of justice. Days turned into years and years into decades. Inside those prison walls, Glynn watched the world move on without him. He saw prisoners come and go, trends rise and fall, and his own youth fade in the reflection of a scratched metal mirror. He lost family members he'd never get to say goodbye to. Friends he once laughed with stopped writing back. Time didn't heal, it erased. But Glynn never let the truth die. He read law books in his cell. He filed motions, wrote letters, and held on to hope even when the courts called him a liar. Then, nearly half a century later, the truth that had been buried for so long finally began to surface. Hidden police reports were uncovered, evidence that had never been shown to the defense. Notes that cast doubt on the eyewitness who identified him, records that proved the case against him was built on sand. Decades of silence crumbled as the truth came into the light. In 2023, after 48 years behind bars, a judge vacated his conviction. Later that year, Glynn Simmons was officially declared factually innocent, making him the longest-serving, wrongfully convicted person in US history. 48 years, think about that. When Glynn entered prison, gas was 57 cents a gallon, and people listened to music on vinyl. When he walked out, cars could drive themselves, and people carried the world in their phones. Yet despite all the years that were stolen, Glynn's story isn't just about loss, it's about endurance. It's about the unbreakable strength of a man who refused to let injustice destroy his soul. When asked how he survived it all, Glynn didn't speak of anger or revenge. He said, "I had to find peace, or I would have gone crazy." 48 years wrongfully imprisoned, and he still chose peace. But as Glynn's story shocked America, another man was waiting, confined to a cell and already on death row. Iwao Hakamada, Japan. In the summer of 1966, a quiet factory worker named Iwao Hakamada was arrested in Japan for a crime that horrified the nation, the brutal murder of a family of 4. Within days, the headlines called him a monster. Within months, the courts sentenced him to death, and within a few short years, Japan forgot his name. But he never left his cell. For 46 years, Iwao Hakamada lived under the shadow of death row, waking every morning unsure if that day would be his last. The walls of his cell became his only constant, the silence around him broken only by the sound of footsteps, each one carrying the possibility of his execution. The evidence that convicted him seemed clear at first glance, a confession and clothing said to be stained with the victim's blood. But behind that so-called certainty was something darker. A confession forced after more than 250 hours of interrogation, and evidence that would later be revealed as manipulated, even fabricated. Years passed. Appeals failed. Japan's courts, known for their near-perfect conviction rate, refused to listen. But his sister, Hideko, never stopped fighting. For decades she campaigned, bringing new lawyers, scientists, and journalists to his cause. And slowly, the cracks began to show. The clothing used as evidence against him was tested again, and the results were undeniable. The blood did not match. Even more shocking, the red stains on the clothing were found to be impossible. Investigators had stored the supposed evidence in a tank of miso, fermented soybean paste, for a year after the murders. The miso's acidity would have turned any real blood black. The stains stayed red because they were planted. By then, Hakamada was an old man, frail, broken by isolation, and suffering from the mental toll of decades awaiting execution. Yet in March 2014, Japan's courts ordered his release, pending a retrial due to his age and mental health. And finally, on September 26, 2024, more than 50 years after his arrest, Iwao Hakamada was fully acquitted. He had spent almost his entire life waiting to hear the words he always knew were true. "You are free." His release was more than justice for one man. It was a reckoning for an entire nation. It forced Japan to confront the dangers of a system where confessions mean everything and doubt means nothing. For Iwao Hakamada, freedom came too late to give him back the years he lost. But it carried a message powerful enough to echo far beyond Japan's borders, a warning about what happens when truth becomes less important than conviction. And while his story marks one of the longest wrongful imprisonments in the world, across the ocean, another tragedy was quietly unfolding, this time in America. A woman trapped not by violence, but by her own mind, and by a system that mistook her illness for guilt. Sandra Hemme, Missouri, USA. In 1980, a 20-year-old woman named Sandra "Sandy" Hemme sat in a police interrogation room in Missouri, confused, medicated, and deeply unwell. She had been in and out of psychiatric hospitals, struggling with severe mental illness and heavily sedated by powerful drugs. But that didn't stop detectives from turning her into their prime suspect for a murder she didn't commit. The case was the killing of librarian Patricia Jeschke, a crime that shocked the small community of St. Joseph. Police were desperate for an answer, and when Sandra's name surfaced, it was easier to build a case against her than to search for the truth. What followed was a sequence of interrogations so aggressive and disorienting that Sandra, lost in a fog of medication and confusion, began to echo back what investigators wanted to hear. Her so-called confession became the backbone of the prosecution, even though it was inconsistent, contradictory, and flatly impossible in parts. There was no physical evidence linking her to the crime scene, no credible witnesses, and no motive. But to the investigators, a confession, no matter how unstable, was enough. Sandra Hemme was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. For years, she was forgotten, a mentally ill woman lost in the system, serving time for a crime that had never truly been solved. But the truth was, sitting in a police file the entire time, evidence pointing to another suspect, police officer Michael Holman, had been ignored. Holman's alibi didn't hold. His behavior during the investigation raised suspicion. And most shockingly, the victim's earrings were later found in his home. Despite this, prosecutors never pursued him, choosing instead to keep Sandra behind bars. It would take more than 4 decades for justice to catch up. Lawyers from the Innocence Project uncovered the hidden files, revealing that police had suppressed exculpatory evidence and built their case on an unreliable confession. The truth dismantled every piece of the prosecution's narrative. After 43 years behind bars, in 2024, a Missouri court vacated her conviction. Sandra Hemme walked out of prison at 63 years old, the longest wrongfully imprisoned woman in U.S. history. Her freedom, however, came with heartbreak. The moment she was released, she was taken straight to her father's bedside in palliative care. 10 days later, he passed away, his final wish fulfilled, to see his daughter free at last. Since her release, Sandra has been living quietly with her sister in Higginsville, Missouri, trying to rebuild a life that was taken from her before it ever began. And in 2025, she filed a federal lawsuit against the St. Joseph Police Department, accusing them of malicious prosecution and conspiracy, demanding accountability for the decades she lost. Sandra Hemme's story isn't just one of injustice. It's a story about a system's willingness to silence the vulnerable and the unthinkable endurance of a woman who refused to disappear. But even as Sandra begins to piece together her life outside the prison walls, another case reminds us how fragile the truth can be. A case where a single lie, the words of a frightened 12-year-old, destroyed a man's entire future. Ricky Jackson, Ohio, USA. In 1975, three young black men, Ricky Jackson and brothers Wiley and Ronnie Bridgman, were arrested for a murder they had nothing to do with. The victim was a white businessman named Harold Franks, gunned down outside a corner store in Cleveland. Within days, police had their suspects. The only problem? Their entire case rested on the testimony of a 12-year-old boy. The boy claimed he had seen the men commit the crime. His story was dramatic, detailed, and convincing, exactly what detectives needed to close the case. But there was no physical evidence, no weapon, no fingerprints, just the word of a child under enormous pressure. At trial, his testimony sealed their fate. All three men were sentenced to death. Ricky Jackson was 18 years old. In the eyes of the public, justice had been done. But in reality, an innocent teenager's life had just been erased. Jackson spent years on death row watching his appeals fail one by one. The boy's story changed over time. Details didn't match, timelines didn't add up, but no one cared to listen. It wasn't until the 1990s that his death sentence was commuted to life in prison, sparing him execution, but not the daily torment of knowing he didn't belong there. Decades passed. Ricky grew from a young man into an old one behind the same cold walls, clinging to hope through books, letters, and faith. And then in 2013, the truth finally surfaced. The now grown eyewitness, Edward Vernon, came forward and admitted he had lied. He confessed that detectives had coerced him as a scared child, feeding him details, threatening his family, and convincing him that telling their version of the story was the only way to stay safe. His recantation shattered the foundation of the entire case. By 2014, after 39 years in prison, all charges against Ricky Jackson were dismissed. He became one of the longest-serving, wrongfully convicted people ever exonerated in the United States. When he walked free, Ricky didn't celebrate. He wept. Decades of his life had vanished. The youth he never lived, the family he never built, the moments stolen by a lie. Yet when asked if he hated the boy who had accused him, he said quietly, "He was 12 years old. They used him just like they used me." Ricky Jackson's story is a haunting lesson about how fragile justice becomes when fear and pressure replace truth. It proved that a single false testimony, once accepted as fact, can destroy not one life but many. After his release, Ricky began speaking publicly about forgiveness and reform, turning his pain into purpose. His story has become a rallying cry for those fighting to end wrongful convictions based on coerced or mistaken eyewitness accounts. But even as America reckoned with his tragedy, another man, across the Atlantic, was enduring his own decades-long nightmare, trapped by the limits of outdated forensics and blind faith in the system. Peter Sullivan, United Kingdom. In 1987, a 23-year-old man named Peter Sullivan was convicted of one of the most shocking crimes in England at the time, the murder of 21-year-old Diane Sindall. He was sentenced to life in prison. The evidence prosecutors claimed was clear: blood traces, fibers, and witness statements that placed him near the scene. But behind the courtroom drama was a truth the world wouldn't discover for nearly 4 decades, that the science used to convict him was wrong. Peter had always maintained his innocence. He said he didn't know Diane, had never met her, and that on the night she was killed, he was miles away. But in the late 1980s, before DNA testing became a reliable tool, juries believed the word forensic was as good as proof. Experts spoke with confidence, presenting partial blood typing and fiber comparisons as if they were facts. And with no one to challenge them, their testimony was enough to send Peter away for life. In prison, Peter's insistence on innocence was seen as arrogance. He was denied parole time and again because he refused to accept responsibility. He spent years in silence, watching others serve their time and leave, while his own world shrank to a few square meters of concrete and memory. As the decades passed, technology evolved, and so did the truth. Advances in forensic science began to expose just how unreliable early testing methods had been. Investigative journalists revisited Peter's case, and lawyers began petitioning for a re-examination of the evidence using modern DNA analysis. Then, after nearly 40 years, came the breakthrough. In 2024, biological material preserved from the crime scene was finally tested with cutting-edge DNA sequencing. The results were indisputable. None of it matched Peter Sullivan. The man who had been branded a murderer was, in fact, innocent. In 2025, his conviction was formally quashed. The Court of Appeal declared that Peter Sullivan's trial had been a miscarriage of justice of historic scale. His 38 years behind bars made his case one of the longest wrongful imprisonments in British legal history. When Peter walked free, the world he entered was unrecognizable. He had gone in during the age of rotary phones and typewriters and came out into a world of smartphones and self-driving cars. Reporters surrounded him, asking how it felt to finally be free. He said only, "Freedom doesn't erase time. It just makes you realize how much was stolen." Since his release, Peter has lived quietly in southern England, dedicating his time to criminal justice reform and supporting others fighting for exoneration. His case reignited national debate over outdated forensic practices and the desperate need for independent review in wrongful conviction cases. But while Peter's exoneration marked a turning point for British justice, across the ocean, another man's story revealed a different kind of horror, not from the absence of technology, but from its misuse. A man sentenced to death on evidence that never should have seen a courtroom. Anthony Ray Hinton, Alabama, USA. In 1985, 29-year-old Anthony Ray Hinton was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, for 2 murders he had never heard of. Within months, he was sentenced to death. The case against him rested entirely on one claim, that bullets from the crime scenes matched a revolver found in his mother's home. The state's ballistics expert was underqualified, the defense lacked funds to hire a proper one, and the jury, mostly white, believed what they were told. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no motive. Just flawed forensics and bias disguised as certainty. Hinton was sent to death row, where he would spend the next 30 years in a concrete cell barely larger than a parking space. He watched 54 men walk past his cell to their executions. Some prayed, some cried, and some said nothing at all. He read the Bible, read Shakespeare, and tried to keep his mind alive as the years bled together. His miracle came through attorney Bryan Stevenson, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. Stevenson took Hinton's case and brought in 3 of the country's top ballistics experts. Their conclusion was unanimous. The bullets that convicted him didn't match his mother's gun and never could have. The entire case had been built on junk science. Yet, Alabama fought to keep him imprisoned for years. Appeals were denied, hearings delayed, and even after the truth was clear, the state refused to let go. It took a unanimous ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court, which declared that Hinton's trial had been unconstitutional, to finally open the door to his freedom. In 2015, Anthony Ray Hinton walked out of prison after 3 decades on death row. He had gone in as a young man and emerged gray-haired and calm, carrying the kind of peace that comes only from surviving the impossible. When reporters asked if he hated those who took his life away, he smiled and said, "I forgave them before I left prison. If I didn't, they'd still own me." Today, Hinton travels the country sharing his story. Proof that innocence alone isn't always enough to escape a broken system. His case exposed the dangers of bad forensics, racial bias, and poverty in America's justice system, and the extraordinary strength it takes to forgive the unforgivable. But while Anthony Ray Hinton found peace in forgiveness, across the Atlantic, another man was still trapped by a lie. A teenager coerced into confessing to a crime he didn't commit. Paul Blackburn, United Kingdom. In 1978, 15-year-old Paul Blackburn was arrested in Warrington, England, on charges related to a serious offence against a minor. He was scared, alone, and had no lawyer or guardian present during questioning. After hours of relentless interrogation, Paul broke down and gave the police what they wanted: a confession that would steal the next 25 years of his life. There was no forensic evidence linking him to the crime, no witnesses placing him at the scene, and no clear motive. But in the eyes of the investigators, A signed confession was enough. Paul Blackburn was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. For years, he was treated as a monster, isolated, beaten, and branded for a crime he never committed. His insistence on innocence only made things worse. The prison system saw it as defiance, not truth. He spent his youth behind bars, growing from a frightened boy into a man who barely remembered freedom. As time passed, his case gathered dust. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the Criminal Cases Review Commission, CCRC, began re-examining old convictions that relied on questionable confessions. Blackburn's file stood out. Psychologists concluded that his so-called confession had been coerced, the product of exhaustion, fear, and manipulation. Modern experts reviewing the case called it a textbook example of a false confession. In 2005, after 25 years in prison, Paul Blackburn's conviction was finally overturned. The Court of Appeal ruled his confession unsafe and his trial a grave miscarriage of justice. When the verdict came, Paul didn't celebrate. He cried quietly, then asked if he could finally go home. After his release, Blackburn began rebuilding the life he'd never had the chance to live. He spoke publicly about the dangers of coercive interrogations, especially for children, and how easily fear can be twisted into guilt. His story forced Britain to confront a painful truth, that a system designed to protect can just as easily destroy when its power goes unchecked. But while Paul Blackburn found justice after a quarter-century of silence across the ocean, another man's fight for freedom would span nearly 3 decades. A man condemned by flawed eyewitness identification and lost evidence. Clarence Moses-El, Colorado, USA. In 1987 in Denver, Colorado, a woman was attacked and brutally assaulted in her own home. When police asked her later who had done it, she said 3 words that would change a man's life forever. "It came to me." She claimed she had dreamed that Clarence Moses-El was her attacker. That dream became the foundation of the entire case. There was no physical evidence linking Moses-El to the crime, no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses, but the jury convicted him anyway. In 1988, he was sentenced to 48 years in prison. Behind bars, Clarence never stopped fighting. He wrote hundreds of letters begging for DNA testing on the physical evidence that could prove his innocence. When Denver police finally agreed to test it, hope flickered, until inexplicably, the evidence was destroyed before it could ever be examined. Cardboard boxes marked with his case number were thrown out, erasing the proof that could have freed him. Still, he refused to give up. In 2012, decades after his conviction, another man, L.C. Jackson, already serving time for 2 similar assaults, confessed that he was the real attacker in Moses-El's case. His confession triggered new testing on remaining DNA samples, and the results were undeniable. The biological evidence excluded Clarence Moses-El completely. After nearly 28 years in prison, his conviction was overturned in 2015, and 2 years later, he was officially exonerated. When Moses-El walked out of prison, he was 60 years old. He had missed his children growing up, lost his marriage, and spent almost 3 decades branded a rapist for a crime born from a dream. Yet when asked how he survived it all, he said, "Faith. I just kept believing the truth would come." His case became one of the most shocking examples of how fragile justice can be, how dreams, assumptions, and lost evidence can outweigh truth and science. Today, Clarence Moses-El continues to fight for accountability and compensation, using his story to expose the cracks in America's reliance on eyewitness testimony, especially when memory, not evidence, decides guilt. But while Moses-El's freedom came from science, finally setting the record straight, another man's fate had once been destroyed by the misuse of it, convicted not by eyewitnesses, but by junk forensic science that never should have reached a courtroom. Ray Krone, Arizona, USA. In 1991, a woman named Kim Ancona was found murdered in a Phoenix bar where she worked. The crime scene was brutal and desperate for answers. Investigators quickly focused on a regular customer, a quiet, well-liked mail carrier named Ray Krone. He had no criminal record, no motive, and no history of violence. But when the police discovered bite marks on the victim's body, they believed they had found their link. Prosecutors claimed that the bite pattern matched Ray Krone's teeth, That single piece of so-called forensic evidence would define his fate. Despite having no fingerprints, no DNA, and no witnesses, Krone was convicted of murder and sexual assault in 1992, based entirely on bite mark analysis, a forensic technique that would later be discredited as scientifically unreliable. Ray was sentenced to death. He spent 10 years fighting from death row, studying his case and writing to anyone who would listen. He became known as the Snaggletooth Killer in the press, a nickname born from the very evidence that would later prove false. In 1996, his conviction was overturned, but prosecutors refused to back down. Instead of admitting fault, they retried him and won again. It wasn't until 2002 that technology finally caught up with the truth. DNA testing, which hadn't been available during his first trial, conclusively identified another man, Kenneth Phillips, as the real killer. Phillips was already serving time for another violent assault. Ray Krone was innocent all along. After more than 10 years behind bars, including time on death row, Krone was fully exonerated. He walked out of prison into a world that had branded him a monster, only to discover that the very science used to condemn him was little more than guesswork dressed up as fact. When asked how he felt toward the system that nearly killed him, Krone said, "They took years from me, but I'm still here, and I'm still fighting." Since his release, he has dedicated his life to exposing the dangers of flawed forensic methods and helping others who have been wrongfully convicted. His case became a turning point in American justice, used in classrooms and courtrooms alike to show that even expert evidence can be deadly when unchecked. But while DNA cleared Ray Krone's name across the ocean, another man's fight for truth was taking shape. A man convicted on nothing but the word of one witness in a crime that would shake Sweden's faith in its justice system. Kaj Linna, Sweden. In 2004, a violent robbery shocked the quiet countryside of northern Sweden. Two brothers were attacked in their farmhouse. One was beaten to death, the other left barely alive. The survivors described their attacker as a man they didn't know. But months later, police arrested Kaj Linna, a 40-year-old taxi driver with no criminal history, no connection to the victims, and no physical evidence tying him to the scene. The case against Linna relied almost entirely on one man's story, a supposed acquaintance who claimed Linna had confessed to planning the robbery. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses, and no recovered weapon, just the words of a single man seeking to reduce his own sentence. Still, in 2005, a Swedish court found Linna guilty of murder and robbery, sentencing him to life in prison. Linna's conviction would become one of the most controversial in Swedish history. He maintained his innocence from day one, writing letters to journalists and legal advocates, begging them to re-examine the case. For years, no one listened. Then, a Swedish true crime podcast called Spår, The Trail, reopened the investigation, and everything began to unravel. Through interviews and evidence reviews, reporters uncovered massive inconsistencies in the key witnesses' statements. Details changed from one telling to the next, timelines didn't add up, and several parts of his story were proven impossible. Even more damning, the witness had received money and favors from police, facts that had never been disclosed during Linna's trial. The revelations caught national attention. After more than a decade behind bars, Sweden's High Court ordered a retrial. In 2017, Kaj Linna's conviction was overturned. He had spent 13 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. When the verdict was read, Linna simply closed his eyes and exhaled. Later, he said, "It's like waking up from a nightmare that lasted half my life." The Swedish government later awarded him one of the largest compensation settlements in the country's history, more than 18 million krona. But no amount of money could return the years he had lost. Since his release, Kaj Linna has spoken out about the dangers of unchecked police power and the ease with which false testimony can destroy lives. His story became a symbol of how one voice, amplified by truth and persistence, can bring down a false conviction. But for all the years Linna lost, his time behind bars was short compared to the lives of others on this list. Because while he served 13 years for a crime he didn't commit, there are those who endured decades before freedom came. men and women who refuse to let the truth die in silence. In the end, justice isn't measured by verdicts or years served. It's measured by the lives it breaks and the truth that refuses to stay buried. Justice may clear their names, but it can never return the years.